Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back to Archaeology with Flint Dibble. I'm here with Professor Dan Hicks from Oxford University and the Pitt Rivers Museum. Here, wait, I wanted to pull up your little profile here. You're the curator of world archaeology there. And our goal is to talk about the book Every Monument Will Fall, which was just published, what, 2-3 days ago, right, Dan?
Absolutely, on the 1st of May, May Day. It's always a good date for any book launch. And so my last book was published on the 5th of November 2020. And so Bonfire Night, Fireworks Night. I think the next best, or maybe even better date is May Day. So it came out on
There you go. So you like to celebrate with your books. And then here, wait, let me pull up the British Museum's other book that you're mentioning, which is about repatriation and restitution, specifically focusing on the Benin bronzes. Let's get that in.
Yes, absolutely. So that's now 4 and a bit years old, but it's out in sort of paperback. I think Pluto have a May Day sale that runs until the middle of May, actually. So the book's incredibly cheap, as are so many others on their wonderful pages. So for any of your listeners that don't know them as a publisher, have a look at other things that they're publishing as well. But yeah, the current book's a bit of a different sort of departure in terms of sort of who has published this. And so it's a Penguin book. It's been a different experience for me in terms of sort of writing it, and there's been a development of some of the ideas as we can talk about.
Yeah, for sure. So it's a nice hefty book, as you can see. Yeah. And it's part like autobiographical, and you have some of your own conversations and thoughts winding through it. That's sort of what frames it all. And you're thinking through what sort of monuments in history mean for us in our world today. So yeah, let's start with the title. Every monument will fall.
Yeah, absolutely. So remember, there's also a subtitle. We can get onto the subtitle in a moment.
Yeah, a story of remembering and forgetting. Yeah,
a story of remembering and forgetting. Exactly. So yeah, I mean, and so let's say at the outset that the book is not called "All the Monuments Must Fall."
Okay.
Which is a reasonable position that sort of some people have about conversations we've had about sort of monuments in sort of recent years. It isn't one that I sort of advocate. It's one, though, that instead says that we need in the UK, across Europe, in North America, around the world, to learn from conversations that have been had for a long time about what we might call memory culture. So how do we remember? Who do we remember? Why do we remember events, individuals, and so on? And at the heart of the book is a set of comparisons, which are based on the University of Oxford, where I work, but are also, go to other universities, other museums, and so on, that sort of talk about how some people are remembered in the form of monuments, and their names are remembered, and so on, whereas others have their physical remains, ancestral remains, abused in after death, and so sit in a sort of cardboard box in a museum, or indeed even worse in the context of sort of one of the histories that I tell in the book. But at the heart of it, it's about how, as sort of someone that works between what I call the 4 A's, and so I work in between archaeology, anthropology, art, and architecture. Which are fields that have, I think, a lot of people who work in these fields would understand that sort of affinity that is there in between those academic disciplines. I mean, I was an archaeologist originally in the field for many years, and then sort of read anthropology as an undergraduate, and then sort of since then sort of art and architecture have sort of come in. But all of those fields essentially are a part of things that relate to heritage, that relate to how to care for the past, or to preserve the past, or the built environment in which we live. And at the heart of it, of course, are choices. So we're always making sort of choices about what we tear down and what we rebuild. I mean, archaeology itself is a process that involves us having to dig sort of into the ground and thereby, removing things that you can't sort of dig a second sort of time. It is an unrepeatable sort of process, in itself. So yeah, I think in sort of, if you like, inherent in those fields is a sense that the world is always changing, and so it's our responsibility to talk about what we hold on to and what we let go, and who we remember, and who the fact that you can't hold on to everything. So that's the title. Every monument will fall if unless a decision is made in order to keep it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's something that I try to convey across a lot with my own public communication, is to try to make the point that, look, archaeology and heritage is extremely dynamic, and we're always making choices. We can't preserve and conserve everything. One of my go-to examples is this tower on the Athenian Acropolis, the Frankish Tower, which Heinrich Schliemann actually organized the campaign to tear down. And because he thought it was an eyesore on the kind of classical landscape that the Athenians wanted to present, in the late 19th century. And so, it's a very conscious decision that is made over what to preserve, what to keep, what not to keep, how to present it, and what stories to tell about our past, if you see what I mean. And so I think your book is a valuable contribution to getting us to think more explicitly about that, because you wrote it kind of, I think, in the context of people tearing down statues and stuff like that in the 20s, right? And
well, that's right. But of course, I mean, let's remember that the fallism movement was not something that was invented in the summer, in that lockdown summer of 2020. And it's so often, whether it's the wider anti-racist movements that was part of as part of the Black Lives Matter movement, or whether it was sort of simply about the conversations about sort of monuments, it's a bit like the restitution question. It's always presented in the media as if it's a new idea, as if someone just thought that up last week. Whereas, of course, for restitution and fallism, they have been actually both sort of African-led movements originally, anti-colonial movements, in the last century, that reach back sort of hand in hand, really, with the civil rights movement in sort of North America and elsewhere. So conversations over, General Lee's in the American South, or images of sort of Cecil Rhodes in what was Rhodesia, after independence, into Zambia and then Zimbabwe. So images of the former, head of the company, sort of Cecil Rhodes, were removed really early on in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, and of course most sort of famously in 2015 in sort of Cape Town. So these conversations over who is kept and who isn't, and sort of what it means to hold on to a monument and what it means actually to sort of choose to remove it, are things that have happened for a long time. One thing I was really interested in, though, was, and so my last book was about returning looted objects from museums, and so the questions over restitution. I've been writing on the fallism movement, and then obviously as well, I mean, anyone working or learning in a university these days is of course aware over those sort of wider movements for the decolonization of knowledge. So it seemed to me that whether it was in the libraries and the seminar rooms over decolonial knowledge, in the museums over restitution, or in the streets about fallism and monuments, all of those movements seem to be responding to quite a narrow sort of time frame in which, between, let's say, the 1870s and the 1920s, sort of culture and art and archaeology and museums and things that we all love were put to work in order to tell sort of narratives that are maybe out of step with our times. So they were put to work to tell stories of sort of cultural supremacy. So that isn't everything that a museum is these days. It is sort of far more than that, and that's why the work of restitution is important. So I just wanted to understand this sort of historical context of what we now call the culture war. So where did that idea come from? You know, we were all of a sudden sort of told that the Restitution conversations or the Fallism conversations was a part of something called a culture war. What's the history of that? Where does it come from? You know, when was...
Tell me what it was. So, because yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I've been a student in archaeology. I started taking classes in the 90s, and these conversations existed before you think of the term culture war that we think of today. So how does this aspect of culture, because obviously museums and heritage are foundational to what we think of as culture, how did they start becoming so weaponized in this kind of political culture wars that that are just dominating our world right now?
Absolutely. Well, and of course, I mean, we're talking in a week in which we've heard more about how the Trump administration are not only removing grants from archaeologists and researchers and from universities in the form of the National Endowment for Humanities and others, but they're using that money to do what? They're going to build a whole bunch of statues in a garden in, DC. So this is also about the prehistory or the longue durée, the long-term history of the Trumpian sort of model of monumentality. One of the points the book makes is that if we look across archaeology from Stonehenge to indigenous communities to monuments of all phases of the past, there are many forms of sort of monumentality, and it's only one form that we're talking about here when we're talking about certain images of figures that are meant to represent a certain idea of heroes from the past. So in the book, I argue that the idea of a war on culture or a weaponization of culture in this way really emerges in the middle of the 19th century. And a part of it comes out of the earlier attempts, which a lot of your listeners will be more familiar with, to use sort of science and natural history for the purposes of sort of racism, basically. And so we all are aware how sort of physical anthropology, measuring people's skulls, all that stuff was something that sort of co-opted anthropology as a discipline in its very early years, and our natural history museums, and they were put to work in order to tell the racist lies that there were different species of human. And of course, over the years, the scientists had no sort of problem by the time you get into the 20th century of saying, actually, this is bad science. It's not true. It isn't right, these arguments. And by the time you got to the end of the First World War, end of the Second World War, any last remnant of those museum displays that told that story of sort of racial supremacy were gone. Actually, they weren't in the museums because they weren't right. But right next door to those museums of natural history were museums of
anthropology,
cultural history, in which art and culture and objects looted from battlefields and the Parthenon marbles and you name it were put to work to tell a very different set of narratives that were actually, or using very different materials in order to tell the same narrative, which was about a sort of cultural supremacism. So in the book, I talk about Frantz Fanon's account of what he called in the 1950s, sort of cultural racism. And it's something we're only just in our disciplines, I think, starting to make sense of. How is it that sort of culture and art was weaponized? These things, as I say in the book, that we imagine in the forms of a monument, even in the form of a discipline like archaeology or anthropology or a museum, how can these things be hurtful? How can they be anything other than really important things that we need to defend? But they were, unfortunately.
I mean, they are. Like, if you think about it, so much of what we decide and how we view the world is built out of what we think of our past was, whether it's our own heritage or our own country's history or etc. And so if we actively do things that harm people, well, that comes from our own understanding of history that justifies in our minds what we do, if you see what I mean. And so I think that that's something we need to be thinking explicitly on, is kind of the ways in which we frame these stories of our past.
Yes, exactly right. And so a part of the history that I sort of tell is about the museum I work in, which is a named museum. It's named after someone a lot of you will have heard of, Augustus Pitt, Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers. Pitt Rivers is the name above the door of the museum. He was a soldier, and his sort of theories of archaeology, and I go very much into the detail of his sort of biography, you know, how he formed his ideas of archaeology and the excavations that he undertook. But there was a militarism that was inherent in that. He was the man who was tasked as a young soldier with the improvement, you know, of the rifle and its adoption as the service weapon of the British Army in the run-up to the Crimean War. So a lot of the story that I tell starts with the Crimean War, and starts with what Augustus Pitt Rivers sort of did after he came home, you know, shell-shocked and sort of traumatized from industrialized war. What is it, you know, what did he do then? He invented a discipline, or he sort of formalized the discipline of archaeology in a very distinctive way that's with us sort of today. And he founded the museum, and then he founded a second museum as well. He founded sort of two museums which were full with archaeology and anthropology objects. So Augustus Pitt Rivers is a very important individual in that history of the culture war. And that's a part of the threads of the book that I try to tell, to try and understand really where we are now, you know, and, you know, what this goes from art into aesthetics, you know, into our understanding of history.
Yeah. So, all right, I have a question of personal curiosity here, having just taught, you know, archaeological thought and the history of archaeological thought. And when you think about kind of the Pitt Rivers Museum, and when you think about Pitt Rivers, he's one of the foundational characters for thinking about typologies and classifications. You know, when you think about different types of stone tools, lining them up and showing them how they look different, or even different types of rifles and showing how they look a little different to create these classifications. How does that very act of classifying, in a sense, relate to value judgments and these culture wars? Do you see that as an overlap at all?
Exactly. So there's a history there, you know, and we can get onto, you know, what he means by that word type, because it's more than just the type, the physical form. He doesn't say he's doing a formal analysis of objects. He calls it type, and a type. You know, the Pitt Rivers is a typological museum. He saw archaeology and anthropology meeting, and really this is the birth of modern material culture studies. He sees that as all about this idea that he has, which he calls the typological. So part of this is absolutely the ripping of objects out of their contexts. So you're not organizing things according to their sort of cultural context or where they're from in the world, or even according to how old they are or the periods of time. Instead, what he's doing is he's organizing objects in terms of his idea that he also calls sort of seriation, that objects are, you know, are essentially improving over time. It's a theory of objects, of the material world, that starts with weapons. So he had improved or overseen the improvement of the rifle for the British, and of course the British and the French and Ottomans won the Crimean War against the Russian Empire. And he argues that this sort of minor part, of the reason for that was that the Brits had more rifles than the Russian muskets. And so that relatively minor improvement in the technology is something that makes, you know, that sort of relates to whether empires fall or succeed. And so this is a sort of theory. He then sort of generalizes that into other forms of weapons. He begins to assemble a museum of weapons in the 1850s in his own sort of private house, you know, in London. So he sort of brings back weapons from the field, from the Crimean War, but he also acquires weapons from sort of soldiers returning from the colonial wars. He acquires objects from auction houses and sort of dealers. So his idea is, let's get every kind of sword, every kind of sort of dagger that we can find, every type of those things that we can get together. And he builds a theory of improvement. That idea that every time someone shoots an arrow, they're seeking to improve how good that arrow is, or how good the bow is. And that, he says, is what leads to, cultural superiority over time. These things, over very long periods of time, these things are improved. He then, importantly, sort of generalizes that theory of weapons into everything in the world, all kinds of objects. And so if you visit the Pitt Rivers Museum now in Oxford, you can see on the top floor, you can see the remnants of his original Museum of Weapons, and you've shown us there some images of some of those. But in the rest of the museum, you've got religious objects, you've got objects of everyday, technology, you've got costume, and all sorts of things. You've even got sort of lights and lighting, objects that relate to, the very sort of basic need to be able to see in the dark. And for all of those, he applies this improvement narrative. So it's a generalization which is so important for us as archaeologists, even sort of today, that we inherit, which is really a model of understanding objects as if they were all weapons and as if they were constantly being improved. So that's a part of the intellectual history here.
I never actually, especially hearing you explain it, I never actually put the connection to that the entire goal was improved efficiency. It sounds so much like capitalism, tech bro type stuff. And I mean, we think about, I think about typology, of course, for organizing and cataloging artifacts that I deal with. And I teach even how, like, cars change over time. You can see models of cars, but some of that is not always meant for improvement. Sometimes that's just aesthetics changes, if you see what I mean. But I suppose you could even conceptualize aesthetic changes as meant to improve on a previous model. And so, I hadn't really thought about that.
Exactly. And of course, think again about the Trumpian model of, what sort of figures or monuments are going to be in this new garden. He said, they mustn't be abstracts. They mustn't be too, degenerate, essentially, is the argument. They need to be literally, figurative, realistic sort of images. So again, there's taste as part of this, and taste that thinks of itself as sort of superior. But that word type also has this other meaning. So there's a pun, there's a sort of in joke when he talks in the context of Oxford, which was, of course, for those of you that know about the history of the Christian Church, was enormously important for the Tractarians, for the Oxford movement, the High Church Anglican movement, for whom the word sort of typological meant something very specific. It meant the idea, as a typological reading of the Bible was to read the Old Testament as a type, as a sort of prefiguration of the New Testament. So, for example, the serpent in the Garden of Eden is seen as a type for the crucifixion, and these ideas that the world in which one is living is somehow sort of foreshadowed. And that, in part, that metaphor is so important for what Pitt Rivers was doing with these objects, because he wasn't trying to trace in a linear way the history from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age, into the Iron Age, and so on. He wasn't trying to do history. He was trying to present an image of in his sort of language, not language we'd use now, of a savage or a primitive past, with which he wanted to contrast his own sort of civilized world. So he really wanted to see this, and there's this theme, and I go into this in the book, this theme that's important in a very secular way for him, that was about sort of manifest destiny. So he began to read the English landscape when he returned from the front line, and I see in the chat that someone has said there's a sort of male or a toxic masculine side to this. Absolutely right. This is also, this is about certain forms of of man, if you like, who, the idea of the what we think of as the human past as being really dominated by this sort of figure of anthropos, at the heart of anthropology, or man with a capital M, as this, as this violent sort of figure from the past. But he reimagined the English landscape, having returned from the Crimean War after serving in Ireland and elsewhere, as if all of the earthworks of southern England were evidence of a great war that had happened in between an indigenous community and an invading sort of technologically superior community. And he imagined that that war was still going on in the present. What was happening in South Africa, what was happening with the invention, of course, of the machine gun and the beginning of a really nasty, horrible phase of sort of Victorian militarism, that was somehow fated. Archaeology could show you that this is a single process of the replacement of one, indigenous sort of population with another, and that and I go into this in the book, that he says this is just fated. These are just extinctions. They're not killings. They're extinctions, and they're cultural extinctions. And the reason it's fated is that some people have got machine guns and some people have got bows and arrows. So you start to see how those ideas over cultural supremacy, and indeed the museum as being put to work to tell those narratives, and indeed our own discipline, archaeology, being used in order to tell those stories, that's equally as sort of problematic as what was going on, for biological anthropology or in the physical anthropology museums or the natural history museum. So that's really what I'm aiming to do in terms of the history of archaeology with this book, is to attempt to look at what our part in the history of the culture war was.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, you might know I'm writing a book on Atlantis, and it includes a good chunk on this 19th century history of the field. Of course, it diverged in a very different way into what we call pseudo-archaeology, while these are in many ways the foundations of what we call archaeology. And so, but there's a lot of overlap, in particular in the kind of, the othering of other cultures, and the way that you can graphically show them, in these kind of displays, is just looking so foreign and therefore primitive, if you will, in a way that kind of really does give the viewer a sense of cultural superiority. And then that, of course, relates to the kinds of stories that we tell about these peoples and their heritage and their past and their present in our world.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's really hard to shake these things off. And I see again in the chat, someone, you have such wonderful people in your chat and listening in. Someone's mentioned the Jared Diamond book,
yes.
book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is exactly right, Christopher, when you say that. Those ideas that are in sort of Diamond's book, which has a sort of a technological determinism sort of to it. That's it's a good book. It's a book that sort of tells the history of the West through histories of technology and sort of disease and so on. But inherent in those ideas that are being repeated 100 years after Augustus Pitt Rivers had made parallel arguments, sort of inherent in that, in the present, is something we inherit, which is that the Victorians wanted to pretend that this was just inevitable. They wanted to say that this was fated. And it wasn't fated because of God, or it wasn't fated because of any other belief system. It was fated because of the belief systems that we call archaeology, anthropology, history of art, museums, monuments, and universities. So that I think is important. So much of this is about what we inherit. I mean, nobody reads Pitt Rivers anymore. That's what's so interesting, and yet he's in, and yet every undergraduate has to learn his name. We have to learn things about he invented typology and so on, and so many of his ideas, are with us in the present. So it's a real issue for those people that talk about the decolonization of the curriculum, or how to face up to these ideas. What do you do when the guy's not even on the reading list, but his ideas are there still? How do you work in a tradition in those ways where you're self-aware of sort of where these ideas come from? And so, to give sort of one example, I talk about lots of the contemporary theory that's out there over materiality, or the sort of jargon that I don't use myself, but people use about sort of non-humans and entangled materialities, and this idea that we need to talk need to talk about the importance and what people call agency of non-humans as well as humans. And it seems to me that risks really repeating the sort of thing that Augustus Pitt Rivers was so interested in, which is seeking to deny humanity to some people, and to say that something like a gun or something like certain objects are more important, or indeed to define humanity in a certain way that is just everyone that you imagine in the past just looks like you or me or Augustus Pitt Rivers or whoever. So we just need to be really, I mean, a big part of the book then is about inheritance. Mm-hmm. I mean, I love museums. I love my disciplines that I work in, but I'm also interested in the fact that in any other sector of society, we wouldn't be forced into a position where, in order to sort of do our job, we could never change the disciplines we work in or the practices that we inherit from the past. Imagine if in, either the criminal justice system or in healthcare, or indeed in sort of business of any kind or any form of government, there was something that was hurting people. There was something that had been done since the 19th century, but was out of step with our times. It had, it was maybe wrong in the first place. It's certainly wrong now.
Dan, I have a really great example.
Yeah. There we go. Absolutely. You have a really good example. Yeah. Because we're told so often, by the people that are the real culture warriors, the people that want a war about culture, the hard right, the extreme right on these questions, and some of the journalists that pick up those tropes and want to write about them in the form of sort of Dominic Sandbrook, as you see here in the Times last week, who was talking about my book. So he's very much not of the hard right or the far right, but he's absolutely, picking up those sort of tropes and arguments, because we are told in museums that that things can never change. We're told that a statue that someone sort of put up sort of 30 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago is something that can never change. And yet there's more than in England and Wales alone. We have more than 20,000 applications for listed building consent every year. We are constantly changing the environment in which we live. Imagine a museum that could never change its displays. Imagine a discipline that could never update its ideas. Imagine if in physics or in math, I don't know, maybe maths is the same. I don't know. Maths can't be the same. Maybe some of the, maybe Latin's the same. I don't know. Maybe some disciplines.
Don't talk to the philologists. I know they think it's different.
Exactly. I'm sure they're not different. Exactly. I'm sure even Latin and ancient Greek, you don't teach the same now as you did in the 1880s. Some things will be the same, of course. A lot of things will be the same, but some things won't. But imagine if you were teaching physics, on a sort of 1890s model. So yeah. That's surely that's got to be the same for our discipline, and certainly for the museums, which are the public facing sides. I mean, it's like your excellent work on YouTube. The museums are really unique parts of universities and of our disciplines in that the public can walk in, and it's for the public dissemination of ideas that are going on in our field. So the idea that we've got to be preserved in aspic, and for things never to change is a really weird one.
And it would be so boring.
We can get into the example that you gave there if you want, and sort of explain that.
Which one? The drinking out of the skulls, you mean, or something else?
The drinking out of the skull, which we haven't got into that for.
I mean, before I just wanted to say one thing. If we kept museums exactly the same without changing, that would be so boring. Why would you ever want to go back to them? Like, we want museums anyway to be a location, a dynamic location for cultural exchange. And if it's just the same display for 200 years, you go as a kid, why go back? Exactly.
And I mean, I'm so worried, as are so many in our sector, that what we're seeing in some parts of the world with the sort of rise of the culture warriors in charge in government, and intervening in the trustee bodies of our national museums, intervening with all the progress that's been made in recent years. I mean, we may even see attempts to put displays back to how it was imagined they used to be.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think again, in terms of some of the monuments, some of the anti-racist monuments in North America, we're already seeing some of those actively removed. So at the heart of this isn't holding on to everything from the past or tearing everything down. This is about the importance of of any community, society, academic discipline, any group of people who can decide on a fair basis, have a vote, whatever it is, decide that they want to hold on to this from the past and to let this go, and being transparent about that process, having conversations about what in sort of Germany they call memory culture, Erinnerungskultur. This idea that we understand not only history, but how we remember as well, the culture of memory. That's important. And that, I think, when it comes to conversations about, Edward Colston, who was pulled down in sort of Bristol, or Cecil Rhodes, who is not yet pulled down in Oxford. One of the big mistakes that people make is to mix up the monument with the man, and to have a long conversation about the rights and wrongs of, Cecil Rhodes, right or wrong, Edward Colston did some good here and there. This is not the person. This is a lump of stone or sort of bronze or whatever. So the decision is whether we want to remember this person, or if we want to remember them in this way, or how we want to remember them. Societies have always reshaped their memories. They've always reshaped their pasts via memory. So I think there has to be a place and so in part the book is an argument for what we learn from archaeology, which is really distinctive from history. Archaeology in some ways has a lot in common with history, but archaeologists also do exactly the opposite of historians. Historians sort of tend to imagine themselves back into the past, into some sort of point in the 16th century or the Roman Empire or whatever, and work their way forward. For us, we start in the present and we dig down. So this is all, this is exactly maybe we sort of meet in the middle somewhere, but we're not, we ultimately, this is, as I say, about how we remember, not about, not only about how we write history.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. That's sort of why I pulled up the statue to try to illustrate it, because this is a statue of a goddess from ancient Athens, but you can see it's been tagged with a cross by Christians. And so it's not just one thing or another. It has a dynamic history that we can start to put together about how it was also defaced with the nose being knocked off, of course. And so
where is it as well? I imagine it isn't where it was found.
No,
it is somewhere else.
This is in the Acropolis Museum in Athens. Yeah, this is in the Acropolis Museum in Athens. So it is where it was found. But and that's a big part of the story too. Exactly, is where we find stuff. Archaeology is dynamic. These objects have their past, their history or whatnot, and how we use them and how we conceptualize them in different ways and different periods says a lot about us and about our predecessors. And I suppose if I can find the right tab, we can even think about that with those skull cups, because is it really a noble tradition? Tell me, I know nothing about this. Tell me what this means.
Okay, so those of you listening can sort of look this up in The Guardian, who were the people that sort of broke the one of the histories, which is a thread, maybe the sort of central thread that runs through the book. And there was a Guardian article, and then it was sort of picked up internationally by a whole host of other other news outlets, and the Times covered it, and it went, it was in the French press and the German press and Portugal and so on. And so I was asked in 2019, to write a history, or to investigate the history of a certain object held by a certain college in the University of Oxford. So this is Worcester College, Oxford, not Oriel College, Oxford, which has been the heart of these conversations about legacies of empire, because they have the image of Cecil Rhodes on the outside, which famously they decided on a democratic basis to remove, and then were lent on essentially by government not to remove. So it hasn't been removed. Instead, this is a very different story, which is about the fact that from 1946 until as recently as 2015, a human skull, which had been altered, had been sort of sawn off at the top. So the top of the head had been sawn off and inverted, and it had been turned into a sort of a chalice with a silver base, had been used at desserts, at sort of formal desserts after high table in the college by the dons and their visitors until as recently as 2015. And there was a name on the silver rim of this desecrated ancestral remains, and the name was not the name of the woman. And we have, the physical anthropologists have said on the basis of the form and shape, it is a female, it's an adult female skull. It was not her name that was on the rim; it was the name Pitt Rivers. And so, understanding why is that, and there are other things written on the rim, other things sort of carved into the bone itself, and there are silver marks and so on. So I was asked really to piece together the evidence to sort of find out what we could say and what we couldn't say about this person, and to help advise the college or to present historical and archaeological evidence in order to help them work out actually what to do next. And so the college had done the wrong thing after doing the wrong thing for a long time, had done the right thing 10 years ago by ending this practice. Mm-hmm. But I guess, as I say in the book, I was asking myself, not really how does such a practice sort of come into being, which is a pretty big issue and important question itself, but how is it made to last? How can it be possible that in the 1990s, in the noughties, up to 2015, it's a practice that continues? How hard is it, even with something so egregious as the use of what it turns out? One of the stories is that it was a Caribbean enslaved woman, and the cup was made. Certainly what sort of backs that up is that the cup has a silver mark of 1838 on it, and the radiocarbon date that the college obtained indicates that it was from the late 18th or early years of the 19th century. But I mean, not simply, as I say, how does it come about, but how is it made to last? How is it that with all of the traditions, whether it's the ones that we were talking about earlier in terms of the framing of thinking as archaeologists, or our theoretical thinking, whether it's the displays in a museum, whether it's images, it's images that for many people in Oxford would mean that Cecil Rhodes's image is essentially a monument to the origins of apartheid in South Africa. Or whether it's this practice at the dining table, how can we think about how we inherit well, how sometimes we're able to break the traditions, but equally how we can try to give some sort of dignity to those people that find themselves not sort of posthumously remembered or memorialized in stone or in bronze, but actually have their bodies sort of posthumously abused. And when you think that the sort of Worcester College, as with so many of the Oxford colleges, remained single sex, it was an all-male college until 1979. We are talking about a sort of gendered issue as well here. In terms of what we can tell about this person, we don't know that it is someone from the Caribbean. We know that there are links in between the person that originally had this item made in the 19th century. We know that when their body was purchased at auction by Augustus Pitt Rivers in 1884, it was purchased after his inheritance of the Pitt Rivers fortune, which itself had been made, in sort of a large part in the Caribbean from, the labor of unfree people. So, and we also know that it was inherited, it was used by Augustus Pitt Rivers at the dining table at his country estate in Rushmore on the Wiltshire-Dorset border. It was then inherited by the grandson who was a fascist, who was a Mosleyite Nazi, who was incarcerated in the Second World War. He was locked up as as a part of the enemy. And the first thing he did when he was allowed out of Oxford and allowed to return to his Oxford College, he was allowed out of jail and he returned to Oxford, is he gave this item to Worcester College and he instigated this ritual. So this ritual this is about the persistence on the one, so there are layers here. There's the layer of colonialism, there's the layer of how that turns over the generations into fascism, and then how it ends up instilled in the heart as a tradition.
So this fascist Pitt Rivers dude gets out of prison and then says, drinking from skulls is a noble tradition, and then everybody does it.
That's what he sets that up. And so then after we reported the facts, or David Bassi, very good sort of journalist, wrote it up, and go to his account for the nuance. His account in The Guardian will give you that. What shocked me, I mean, we did have a conversation, obviously with the publisher and with others about what would be what are the possible attack lines for the culture warrior right. The increasingly, odd voices, really. There's an oddness to where we are on X and all these other. I left X in the end because it was just so bad, with all these uses of AI for you never quite know what's real and what isn't. And then the other day, at the time of sort of recording, I think it was yesterday, we had the White House tweeting an image of sort of Donald Trump as the Pope. I mean, when we're dealing with that sort of imagery, it's hard to know, what they're going to make of a history like this. But Dominic Sambrook, who some of you, I mean, apparently other podcasts are available, but I'm afraid that the most successful one in sort of history, in the history field, and your rival or sort of competitor here in some ways, is a podcast that's called The Rest is History. And Dominic is one of the two people alongside Tom Holland, who you'll be happy hasn't yet said what he thinks about the rights and wrongs of the abuse of human bodies in this way.
Tom Holland has, never Dominic, but
Yes, exactly. But no, Dominic wrote this piece in the Times where he said, "Well, I applaud Oxford for this sort of noble tradition," and Dan Hicks is just essentially attacking the institution. Well, of course, as I wrote, I had a letter sort of published in the Times on the following day, which I was happy that they published my letter at least, where I said he just has things upside down. He's trying to defend a tradition instigated by a Nazi aristocrat in 1946, which the college rightfully ended 10 years ago. He's thereby criticizing the openness of the college and their decision to make that change. Whereas I'm saying, absolutely, the institution's done the right thing, and we need to understand these histories. We can't have things like this, which are open secrets or sort of hidden aspects of how we inherit things from the past. So a big part of the book is about transparency and how transparency can give you dignity. Some of the histories of empire are things that some sort of people find sort of personally difficult if they're middle-aged white men like you and me, Flint. A lot of people don't want to have these conversations. But it's essential that we do. And a part of what I hope the book will do is it will take, what I try to write in terms of what we can say about this unnamed, sort of denamed woman and her body, and the conversation about what should happen to her next. But then remember that we have an unknown number, maybe 100,000, maybe 400,000 in the UK alone, maybe more. We just don't know, of human beings whose ancestral remains are in our museums, are in our universities and our medical collections, and we haven't started at scale to talk about restitution or to talk about what to do where the violence was such that it involved the removal of any sort of trace of who this person was, their name, where they came from. What should we be doing with those things? And I don't have an easy answer for that. I don't have an easy answer for what the college should do. At the moment, this item, this person, or the remains of them are sort of sitting in a cardboard box in an archive, which of course is what everyone else in the museums world would say you should do. But surely we can't keep these people, these ancestors, forever locked up at a point at which there can be no scientific reason for holding onto them. So yeah, that's a big part of, and I think thinking about those issues and sort of trying to link them up to issues over monumentality. What if we think about this item as a kind of monument? What if we think about the way the fascist was trying to abuse this person without it being about trying to justify colonial war exactly? It was just about dehumanization. It was just about, of course, no one would have thought that no one knew who this person was, although they all told histories and sort of narratives emerged around it as they do, but nobody thought, oh, this was the former sort of principal of the college, or this was a former vice chancellor, or this was Augustus Pitt Rivers's head. I mean, the history of Augustus Pitt Rivers' own skull appears at the end of the book, but you'll have to read the book to find out about it.
I mean, I think what's key here is to not be unthinking, because look, as historians, we recognize that traditions are always changing. The monuments we see are being torn down and being built in new ways. Our cities around us are vibrant. And so we should be actually discussing what to do with the situation, the physical situation, the material situation, the condition that our museums and archives and our cities and stuff are in, because we should be active agents in that, right? I mean, like that's, I think, the key thing, because in the end, I think you're really right. Look, as a historian, every monument will end up falling at some point or another. And so in the end, it's sort of up to us. What do these monuments mean, and what kind of stories are we going to tell about them? And I guess to my question for you then is, like, we don't have to belabor the skull cup point, but I think it's an interesting point when these conversations happen in the public. People sort of say, oh, but my previous generations of my family have been doing this and things like that. But sometimes I feel like people are very unthinking, because the traditions that existed 50, 60 years ago are very different from how we celebrate them today, even if we might still have a Christmas tree or something like that. So how do we express that point that our view of history and traditions and monuments is dynamic to people that oftentimes unthinkingly think of them as static and locked in time and place?
Yeah, exactly. So one of the arguments, a really, really important point, Flint, thanks. I mean, one of the things I say in the book is that if you take something like a museum collection, or a museum as people visit it, and people think of something like the Pitt Rivers or the British Museum or the Metropolitan Museum in New York, or the Quai Branly in sort of Paris, and they think of these things as fixed, as unmoving. The whole point is, it's conservation. Things are being kept the same. That's what a museum does. It's a sort of it's an instrument to intervene with the passage of time. It makes time stop, and of course, in part, that is the artifice of the conservator and the curator to make it seem that these things are never going to decay, and so on. But at the heart of it, those museums, those objects you see on display are just a tiny number of the objects in the collection as a whole. Often, not only 99%, but 99.9% of the objects in any museum will not be on display. And then think about actually what we know about those objects in the first place. Well, often we don't have an accurate database of them. I mean, when the British Museum was found, if you remember, 2 years ago, was found in, absolutely impossibly, you would think, to be stealing, it was alleged, from itself.
Yeah.
That at the heart of that story, with objects going missing, at the heart of that story was the fact that there isn't an accurate database of what is held by the museum, that there were perhaps 4 million or so objects of the maybe 8 million or maybe 9 million objects. I mean, if our largest and most significant and sort of best funded museum doesn't even know how many objects it's got, 8 million or 9 million, and we even now, a couple of years on, we don't know much more. that reminds you that none of these pasts are particularly fixed, because we can't even count them. Every time you open a box in a museum, you find and sort of count them out, you'll get a different number. I mean, the last remaining sort of great archaeological sites are our museums. They're, no one knows what's in them, and they're filled with, other people's treasure.
We talk about this all the time. The archaeology of the 21st century is excavated in the museum storage. And, and it's something that I think people don't get across, because these displays are so fixed. You go to the British Museum and the same kind of stuff is on display. You go to the Pitt Rivers Museum and the same kind of stuff is on display. But in those basements, behind the scenes, is where there's just so much material that all has its own stories to tell that are absolutely fascinating, and many of which also need to be reconciled and restituted as well.
Exactly, and it's a theoretical point as well, I think, because often we as archaeologists understand things that a lot of people that intervene in these debates don't, which is that objects are able to carry different meanings and so on, and the sort of diversity of human cultures is, of course, where we see a lot of flow and instability, and things can be rewords and so on. But also objects themselves aren't so solid in their own right, and so to foreground a material thing, it's not always. It can be fragmented, it can be dropped, it can turn into 1,000 fragments, and actually that's just in the nature of things. One of the mottos for this book, and I always like to have mottos for my book, one of the mottos is to stay with the fragments. So part of the argument is, in the case of this abused, denamed human life, but also in the case of the partial remembrance of imperialism in the form of sort of monuments, we're never going to piece it all back together and understand everything that ever happened in history. That's obviously crazy. And we're never going to necessarily piece back together someone's whole life when the history of their afterlife has been, one of abuse and one of actively sort of trying to take their identity away. But instead, we can work with those fragments and try to tell them and try to find some sort of dignity, some sort of resolution, some sort of hope, that's in those, that's in sort of what we inherit in our institutions. So I think it's a theoretical point as well, which is just, let's not sort of trust objects to be any more true or firm and sort of solid than words or ideas.
Which is how you start the book. You start the book about how statues lie and about how objects lie,
But also how lies take a set of different forms, and there are even lies that aren't even, you don't even hear them. You're encouraged to repeat them in your body, in your sort of physical mannerisms, in your framings, and the role of an anthropology of lying, I say at one point, is not to debunk the lie, but to ask how it came about and to understand how it works. In order to understand sort of when we have been lied to in those ways. I
was going to say, in a sense, like this display on the shrunken heads, where you talk about not you, but the curators that put this together, that are talking about how these remains communicate these kind of points. And it's not about debunking them; it's about understanding the baggage in what they tell us in our culture.
Yes, exactly. So as I sort of talk about in the book, there's a section on that case which was called the treatment of dead enemies. It went in sort of 1904 or so under a curator named Henry Balfour, who wrote at the time about how he thought museums ought to, part of the function of museums was as kind of sort of horror shows, that a part of the museum's work should be to actually scare people and to tell people that there are these, ideas, these images of the supposedly savage or barbaric or primitive. But of course, to remove those items from sort of display, makes sense. I mean, the whole sort of message of the case was to invent a category of so-called headhunter societies that he argued he implied were was a realistic, helpful sort of typological sort of category for human societies, and he assembled human remains from South America, from India, from Aboriginal Australia, from Nigeria, from all over the world, and he racked them up in order sort of to say, or to imply, well, okay, this is how they sort of treat their dead enemies, and so they take their heads and so on. In the rest of this museum, it's how we treat our dead enemies, because these are the spoils of war.
Sorry, I want to challenge you for a second. I'm American. I've moved to the UK fairly recently. When I came to the Pitt Rivers Museum, I'm showing photos from my trip there. I was shocked, and I'm still sort of shocked at how it's fairly out. I get that there's some new signs, and there's some explanations that I think are valuable and useful, but I would imagine that the majority of museum goers don't always read those signs so carefully, and so that message, because the curators oftentimes decided to keep the same sort of vibe, if you see what I mean, from the traditional displays. Yep. I worry that it's unconsciously still transmitting some of these messages even today in 2025. And so I was wondering, you're a curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum. Tell me your thoughts on this.
Exactly, and I certainly can't speak for the institution or for the University of Oxford, but I can. But one of the great things about which we should see more of in our museums is our university museums mean that as an academic working in a museum, I've got academic freedom. I can offer my expert sort of judgment, and other people can argue back, and as you know, we can have an argument about it, and we can have a back and forward. Exactly. So, yeah, at the heart of it for me is the sense of, well, I mean, I was in Stanford on a visiting lectureship last fall, and there, of course, as we have at the Field Museum, as we have across the United States, not only ancestral human remains but also ancestral objects are being covered up under the new so-called NAGPRA laws, the laws for the Restitution.
The laws aren't that new; they're just taking way too long to be enacted.
No. There was a new one that came in early 24. Okay. There's an updated NAGPRA law after the original 1990s one. And so that update means that objects that may be from funerary context, may be significant not just as representing ancestors, but actually constituting ancestors, should not be on display until full consultation has been undertaken with the appropriate Native American or First Nations sort of group. So you've got large numbers of sort of cultural objects in the cases which are simply covered up. And that's not happened in Europe yet. You know, that isn't a step that we have taken, but it's one which is very normal now. It's happening all over America. So yeah, there are really significant issues to be raised here, because for so many Indigenous and African communities, objects that we would say are, you know, cultural or artistic objects, and we make a distinction there with an unmodified human skull, and again maybe with a so-called sort of modified piece of tissue from a human being, you know, whether it's bone or hair or whatever. All those distinctions often make no sense at all for groups who care about these ancestors. So it can be that there's an artwork, there's a piece of wood, there's an object that's made out of lots of different materials, is as much actually, you know, part of sort of an ongoing ancestral presence as, you know, the physical human remains. So that's a conversation. It's a live conversation in our museums. You know, what do we do with these issues? And it has to be case by case. I mean, these have been the decisions made by North American institutions. It's been a change in the law. We're not there. That's obviously only for Native American and I think also First Nations sort of context. But yeah, you know, these are ongoing conversations. That's the exciting thing about museums, is of course they're always changing because the world is changing around us, right? And so it's listed. And I think what's so exciting in our museums, and maybe for our monuments as well now, is we're at a point where we can talk about caring for people more than we care for things. We can say, actually, we care about human, what people value, but also what they're hurt by. and we're interested in a democratic process through which the people who are, what we used to use these words, sort of source community, maybe now we talk more in terms of descendant communities, because this is about inheritance over time. But any stakeholder, audience, community who's sort of part of something we inherit from the past, we need to listen to those voices. We need to have ways of listening in which, when we're not just going to pull up the drawbridge and say, we're going to keep things exactly the same, but we can allow our museums and our public spaces for memory and our university disciplines to be things that are changing and sort of keeping in step with our times.
Yeah, I suppose there's at least something a little honest about our current iteration of the culture wars. We're all opposing what other people who we disagree with are doing, but at least we're having an explicit, honest conversation about the permeability of our institutions, our traditions, our monuments, our art, and we're at least having the conversation about what we think we should be valuing and preserving and moving forward on. And I don't think we're in anywhere near a level of consensus, but at least we're being a little more explicit about that, I suppose.
Exactly, but we can have consensus over methods, and that consensus could be, should be, in my view, about being case by case. So when it comes to restitution, it was normal, 25 years ago, for restitution in the very different cases of Nazi looted art, in the very different cases of the return of ancestral human remains, and then in the past sort of 10 years or so, or what I've called in my last book, in the British Museums, I talked about the 2020s as being the decade of returns. In this decade, it's become just untenable to say, well, okay, restitution's a normal part of our ethical sort of curatorial practice in those instances, but we're never, ever going to give back an African object that's a cultural object. It just didn't make any sense, because we learn from those instances that it is case by case. And I'm old enough to remember, when people said it was impossible to return Nazi looted art. Who would you return it to? How would you do it? How much work would it be to do the provenance work? But actually, what institutions, art galleries around the world did is they appointed a provenance curator, and they dug into those histories, because they didn't want Nazi looted art on display in there, and that's what the public wanted as well. They didn't want to see these things. It's the same for human remains, but we have not seen the progress we might do. So the book argues in step also here in the UK with the all-party parliamentary group for restitution and for reparation. It argues for a ban on the sale of ancestral remains at auction. Remember, this apart, one of the histories here is about someone that was bought and sold at auction, and I think it's amazing that the fact that sort of Pitt Rivers for 5 guineas could buy a woman's head to drink out of in 1884, that would also be entirely legal, today. I mean, that's just,
I mean, there's whole online market in human remains. I'm hoping to have Damien Huffer on at some point to talk about his research on that.
Yeah, he's got a lot to say about that. And of course, we have managed to ban ivory. So the ivory trade has been banned, but we have not yet banned the sale of.
And I mean, as someone in the chat puts in, this is all connected. The video I released 2 days ago, in a sense, I document examples of these pseudo scholars, these pseudo archaeologists, basically taking looted or forged antiquities and then making YouTube videos that proves their lost civilization. And so, this is all very much tied in these various conversations. It's a real battlefield, I guess.
Absolutely. And so, equally in terms of the policy piece, it's important that we have full transparency about what's in our museums. Again, that's going to help with the important work that you do, over archaeology, that's, archaeological truths that get warped, unrealities that get invented. Actually, when archaeologists ourselves can't be completely transparent about what's there, sort of reimagine our museums more like libraries than like sort of repositories or sort of prison cells, actually allowing sort of research on objects more, and allowing basic sort of databases to be open, and that will allow in turn the conversations over the return of ancestors or the return of ancestrally looted objects as well. This is all part of making our museums sort of fit for our times, and it links in to conversations about monuments in the public sphere as well, because again we seem to have lost sight over of sort of what's so important for heritage management, which is that we need to place the values of the people that sort of live in a place or are part of an institution first. So I say that the fact that sort of Cecil Rhodes, there was a vote to remove him, and that was reaffirmed another year later, and then the decision was made to not remove him, or not yet remove him, or whatever it is. That sort of the sense in which he's maybe falling a little bit, he's beginning to fall. I say in the book that offered the condition for writing this book.
Yeah,
it reminds us that falling takes quite a long time, and I use a poem by Emily Dickinson called "Crumbling is not an instant's act," where she gives this sense of actually falling does not happen in a second, and so the crumbling is not an instant's act for the for the case, let's say of Edward Colston, means that the campaigns for removing Colston were live in the 1990s, and there was a generational shift, and then another generational shift, and then he came down. There were attempts to do it the right way, and to do it via what then was English heritage and so forth, but eventually he fell. The same can be said for Cecil Rhodes in a host of different instances. So there's hope, even in terms of restitution. Restitution has a long history that reaches back in terms of the Benin bronzes, for example. The first items were returned to the Oba in 1938. So obviously these things take time, and I think that's a real sort of sense of hope. And so one of the things that I think I hope that people will sort of take away from this book, Every Monument Will Fall, is that sense that change happens intergenerationally, and that we need to continue. When something's right for a discipline, it can take time, and there's always people that will say that things should never change. But ultimately we can do the right thing in the end.
I think that's right, and I think there is room for hope. I think that's an important case to make across, and I think a lot of people that despair, we get caught up on things not improving fast enough, and there's a lot of anger involved at times, but it's hard. I mean, as you wrote here in the Telegraph, look, it's on a case-by-case basis. Every single object, every single individual remain requires countless hours of research, and then consulting all the various stakeholders involved, then thinking through more research, and then trying to figure out different bureaucratic, legal, and whatnot solutions that are ethical as well. And so it's it really is just a slow slog. It's fixing the mistakes of the past, let's say. It takes a lot of work and time and effort. Far more than
exactly. And of course, you're never going to fix the mistakes of the past. It's about agency in the present, though. So one thing, when the Sarr-Savoy report came out, which was the report that sort of Macron commissioned, that kicked off so much of this activity about restitution back in 2017-18. One of the things that their report said, and of course we've now seen France making returns to Madagascar and to Senegal and to Benin and so on, was actually, this is about consent. And I remember at the time a lot of people saying, well, what is this language of consent, this language of sexual violence? What is that doing in our museum space? What's that? What does that mean? But of course, we've sort of learned in the process as a sector that fundamentally restitution is about consent in the past. Were things sort of taken with violence or actually against sort of free will, or were they even inalienable objects that could never be given away in the first place, or sold or bought or whatever? But it's also fundamentally about consent in the present. So how do you make sure that these decisions are being made, not just being made by so-called experts like me, but the fact that that expertise is in the curators, but it's in many other people as well who have a perspective. And I think that can go, if we join the dots between what counts as a monument, what counts as an object in a museum, how we think about the common inheritance that we have across our museums, our monuments, our universities, and our museums. Actually, we can learn something about sort of what archaeology is in the present, and as I say, we can sort of read that into listen to and center the voices, that need to be centered in the present. So yeah, this is not a biography of Augustus Pitt Rivers, but there is the history of his life in there. It's equally not an anti-biography. It's not a hagiography. It's not a takedown. It's a holding up his life against that of Cecil Rhodes and the people that are remembered by institutions like Oxford and many, many other institutions around the world, against those people whose voices are silenced, whose lives are actively erased. And that's why the subtitle is a history of story of remembering and forgetting.
Yeah.
There's a lot of it, I should say, just as we move towards the end, I should say for your listeners, what may not be obvious is there's a lot of writing in there that is about sort of non-archaeologists. So there's a lot of Saidiya Hartman, for example, really important African-American writer, Sylvia Wynter, who's a great sort of theorist of ideas of man and how that relates to the sort of ideas of who counts as a human. There's a lot of Stuart Hall, one of the key sort of cultural theoreticians of the 1900s, of the 1970s, 1980s here in the UK, and a host of Maggie Nelson, the writer, all sorts of other people. So so it's eclectic, and I think we need to be eclectic in our reading. We all need to read outside of the usual suspects in terms of what I'm calling the 4 A's, and actually learn from other disciplines and learn from other fields. So I also try and do a bit of that.
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially as we start to think about, what to do with the world around us. It's not about one perspective. It's about trying to multivocality and about thinking about all the different kinds of perspectives and stakeholders about how to make these decisions. And so, yeah, we have to really actively read more widely, and not just in the English language. We have to do the best we can to hear different voices from around the world. Which is hard. One of the things I was struck by when you talk about sort of whether you're judging Pitt Rivers or whatnot is everybody says you can't judge these people by the standards of our time. But I think the key thing that people forget is, well, even for the standards of their own time, these people were assholes to other people. And so it's sort of like, yeah, you got to remember that these people were colonists who were doing very nasty things to other people. And yeah,
absolutely. So yeah, I mean, I think, and again, at the end of it, it sort of brings these issues up to date. It talks about exactly, as you say, what are the kind of attack lines that we hear against our disciplines in terms of don't judge people by the by the past. Don't who are you to judge? I mean, this isn't about judging anybody. None of this is. This is about something much more creative and hopeful in terms of how we remake sort of memory culture. So fundamentally, it's about memory, really, more than anything. And I think that that's important for your. I mean, I learned so much from your work in terms of how to correct the fight that archaeology has in terms of what's obviously fake. And what's obviously scientifically right, and of course, I very much see archaeology as a science as well as
for sure,
as an art. But we also need to talk about the fake memories and the real memories, or the memories that we choose to have. There's this odd sense when you're walking around central London with all these sort of figures from the imperial past, and I sort of talk a lot about walking around Hyde Park. Hyde Park was one of the key mnemonic landscapes for empire, from
it is
from the Albert Memorial to the physical energy image, which of course has this history related to Cecil Rhodes, through to the Wellington Arch and so on. So that's about, if you walk around it, it's like a sort of like a case after case of involuntary memory. You're having someone else's memories forced onto you, from from another millennium, from the 19th century. You're being forced. These are your memories.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, as a society, maybe we can do better than that. Maybe we want to change our memories, or maybe we want to have our own memories, and we can reshape it. So I think exactly as you're doing for science, we need to do the same for memory. We need to talk about actually which are the memories that we want in the present.
Which, I mean, to be frank, that's how I see my argument with these individuals and this group. What they're trying to do is create a different form of historical memory, and it oftentimes goes back to these 19th century antecedents as well. And so it's about trying to think through, hey, yeah, let's think through A, what actually is our evidence, and then B, what are the stories that fit that evidence, that resonate in our world today, that matter, and help us construct our narratives of memory and identity and behavior, in many ways.
Yeah, exactly. And so in order just to wrap up, I mean, I see one of these sort of lines that we hear again and again from someone in the chat who says, actually, let's leave all the monuments up, and it would be a pity to destroy them all. Which monuments are we talking about? The whole argument of this book is that we can't hold on to everything. We don't live in a theme park. We can't live in a museum outdoors, and even our museums are constantly changing. So where does this idea that the past is under attack whenever we want to change it in the present? That is the framing of the culture warrior right. And my book tries to tell the history of where that framing comes from, where that idea that sort of culture has been weaponized so that it seems always to be something that needs to be held on to, no matter what. I mean, to give you an example, just to finish on maybe a personal one. In September 2021, there was a new sort of culture secretary here in the UK called Nadine Dorries.
Okay, yeah.
Within 36 hours of her appointment, she overruled historic England experts who had emergency listed an industrial monument on Teesside, which was called the Dorman Long Tower. And Dorman Long was a name that was a part of my family, because my father was a coal miner, his father and his father before him. And actually my sort of great grandfather worked at the Ferry Hill pit when Dorman Long, the company, sort of took it on. Took it over in the 1920s. And so Dorman Long, as with so many tens of thousands of families with a link to the northeast of England, Dorman Long was an important part of our heritage. It was emergency unlisted, and was demolished. We watched it live on TV. It was pulled down. Several months later, just a little bit afterwards, under Dorries, there was around the corner from the Cecil Rhodes Monument in Oxford, there was a plaque that no one had really thought about, sort of looking after. And indeed, there had been, again, experts from historic England said this is not a significant monument. It says that he used to live in some digs as an undergraduate somewhere near here. Our expert judgment is that this should not be kept. And she overruled that, and she listed it. So that's the culture war in action. Mm-hmm. Things are always going to go, and things are always going to stay. And the experts from historic England were thinking about the significance of those images, of those monuments for wider communities. But nonetheless, one monument from the 20th century to industrial history, and one to imperial history, one was destroyed and one wasn't. And that seems to me, in both cases, in my view, those experts from historic England were exactly right. The fact that the Culture Secretary intervened in order to overrule it shows that, essentially what I've been saying all along, that we are making decisions all the time about how we shape our past, what we hold on to and what we don't. But those decisions have to be a combination of expert judgment and what a democratic sort of decision makes. So we can't, of course, hundreds of listed buildings are actually knocked down every year.
Yeah.
And there's a process for that. But we need a conversation about our memory culture. And I think, you just saw so sort of clearly what sort of a war this was, with the choices made and the interventions made over on the one side, Dorman Long, and on the other side, yet another monument to Cecil Rhodes. Like we sort of didn't need another one. I mean, there are 18 images of him in the collections of the National Portrait Gallery alone. There are, and of course there are many that have been removed over the years. So at the heart of it, this is a book that tries to talk for a new sort of national and international conversation about what we keep and what we don't, that avoids the binarism of, oh, you're attacking monuments because you're talking about things changing and therefore we need to defend them. And there was I don't know if that guy's on X anymore. I left X, but there was the guy that had the feed called Save Our Statues.
Oh yeah, I vaguely remember that. Yeah.
That sort of, down to every last sort of garden gnome.
And I mean, that's the reality. You can't save everything. So it's always going to be a conversation about what we choose to preserve and what we choose not to. And different institutions and people are going to make different choices for different reasons. And that's just life, because that's what we see with these kind of culture wars, is different groups advocating for keeping and saving different things. And so, thanks for coming, Dan. Where can everybody find you on social media?
So social media. So I'm not on X anymore. Thank goodness. There were just too many, fascists and rubbish, and endlessly, just a lot of sort of Donald Trump and Elon Musk, which I don't. Don't have any interest in. I do, for those Elon Musk fans though, I do at one point talk about the inherited, the lines that you could draw between Augustus Pitt Rivers, FRS, because he was the fellow of the Royal Society, and Elon Musk, FRS. And they have a similar, when Musk talked about the fact he was dark Gothic MAGA, there is a side of the dark Gothic that's there in Augustus Pitt Rivers' use of the skull that I talk about, and I try and join the dots between one sort of Gothic and another, a sort of Gothic continuum that includes the neo-Gothic of the Pitt Rivers architecturally, that talks about all that. So anyway, but I'm not on X. You can find me on Instagram at what am I?
Are you normally Prof Dan Hicks?
Prof Dan Hicks, at Prof Dan Hicks. On Instagram, the same on Facebook. You can find me on LinkedIn, and you can find me on all the other usual things, just everything except X. I mean, I think what's interesting about social media, we've had to diversify and to have a different set of, one set of conversations here on Insta, another set on sort of, Blue Sky, which I am on again, the same handle.
Yeah, I linked you there because I knew that one.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for coming on. And I think these are valuable discussions, and I hope it gets everybody thinking about how we actively, consciously create memory and forgetfulness and our monuments and our physical space around us even. So
absolutely. So apologies that we haven't been able to respond to everyone in the chat, but next time I can come back
we'll get you on again for sure.
At some point, Flint, about the Caribbean, people have been asking about, or about other parts of the Pitt Rivers.
Yeah,
I'd love to.
Or maybe if I come up to Oxford, we could do one in person. That would be fun.
We could do one in person. I mean, your work is so important, and thank you for everything that you're doing on those other fronts as well. Big fan of everything that you do. So, thanks very much. It's been an honor to.
They all say on X that all the archaeologists have abandoned me because I've disgraced the field.
Well, that's not true.
I'm not worried at all. Here, wait 1 second. I got to end with my little song that somebody created. Hi, my name is Flint, and I'm an archaeologist. Someone created this, making fun of my name.
This is your real name, right?
Yeah, it's my real name. Thank you all. It was a pleasure.
Thanks very much. Lovely to see you, Clint.